So our first speaker tonight is Lorens Holm. Lorens Holm is a reader in architecture and director of the Geddes Institute for Urban Research at the University of Dundee. He is author of Brunelleschi, Lacan, Le Corbusier, Architecture, Space and the Construction of Subjectivity, published by Routledge in 2010. This text argues that architectural space is structured like the Freudian unconscious, what Lacan called the field of the other. Lorens has published his speculative research on questions of space and questions to do with the private and the public places of our city in many different journals, including Perspecta, Critical Quarterly, Architectural Design, and the Journal of Architecture. His talk tonight is titled Architecture and Its Objects. Please welcome Lorens Holm.
Thank you. Just to say that I was really kind of flabbergasted, actually, and tickled and pleased to be invited to do this. I think I got an email out of the blue from Joseph, 6 months ago or something, and I'd never heard of Graham Harman before, and it was an incredible opportunity for me to read a completely different approach to objects and space, and I hope maybe it's been an opportunity to deepen my own thoughts, such as I have them. I'm going to read most of this paper, which I know is terribly boring, but I'm going to do that because if I start to talk it, I'll probably take forever. I just was going to, the talk is called Architecture and Its Objects, but actually I'm going to talk about space mostly. It's about space, which I guess has always been something I've been interested in, and I think it poses some challenges for this kind of object-oriented philosophy. But just to say, there is a kind of cult of the object in architecture, and I just thought I would just show you one or two images. What did that do? Could you just flick it? I know the technology is wrong. This is just all about the cult of the object. Go do another and another. It's all objects. And then finally something, still objects in space, and do another. And at this point, it seems to me something's happening between architecture and the subject of architecture. And then finally the next one. This one is very interesting to me because it really shows how an architecture might contain a person, and that person imagines something, actually more architecture to situate the subject. Let's go to the next one then. And now I'm going to begin. What exists for architecture is space. It is hard to imagine a practice of architecture without it. Space is the material and necessity of architecture. We make space so that we can put objects in it. Harman's argument for the ontological primacy of objects is one half of a debate about whether objects or relations are the primary building blocks of the world. As odd as this tussle may seem to the non-philosopher, it's not as if this debate were foreign to architecture. It is shadowed in architecture by the opposing positions of Aldo Rossi's theory of types. The type is the archetypical symbolic object, in my opinion, and Bernard Shumi's event architecture, although I don't think most people see them as making mutually annihilating ontological claims. An object-oriented ontology might initially look plausible for architecture. This thing about the cult of objects. Architecture is about arranging objects in plan. But space is the precondition for arrangement. The question, where or how does space figure in ontology? Harman argues in Collapse 3 that we can speak about objects being touched by their qualities, that they have a relation or proximity to them. And in the quadruple object, which I think was assigned reading for this course, and in the quadruple object, he writes that space is a relation between a real object and its sensual qualities. In Harman's ontology, each object is a fourfold complex comprising a real and sensuous object and real and sensual qualities. And space is a function of this relation. The question about space is paradoxically spatial. Is space internal to the object, an emergent property of object structure, as Harman would say, or is space external to the object, which for space is simple? Either space is in the object or the object is in space, and I think probably architecture would argue the latter, and I think that's where the challenge that architecture poses for Harman. That's where it comes from. It is remarkable that a practice as material as architecture should have as its object and necessary precondition something as immaterial as space, which is everywhere and nowhere all around us. Space and time are the fundamental elements for architecture because it is with space and time that architecture structures the relation between objects and subjects. This necessity for spatial and temporal spacing, or spatial and temporal temporizing, makes architecture absolutely different from the art object. Irrespective of whether or not the art object contains any space, it is still possible to speak unequivocally of it as an object. The space of the art object is rarely part of the art. The subject of the art object is rarely incorporated in the art, whereas the subject of architecture is always within it. By subject, I mean the subject of architecture, its intentional occupant. That's sort of us. We're the subjects of architecture. Elsewhere, I've argued for the spatiality of this subject. My book was mentioned, and that it's in there. The object is an intentional object, usually an object of desire for a subject. This paper will look at objects, subjects, and space from the point of view of architecture. It will have bearing on an ontology of or through architecture. So anyway, now I'm going to begin with this one. Let's see how this works. Think of that paradigm spatial scenario that puts an object before a subject. I stand before the altar contemplating my salvation. I've just entered the nave. At the other end, the altar. Between us, a space which positions us, qualifies us, signifies our importance. Those who are familiar with my work will recognize this scene as one of my cliches. This architectural scenario that situates a desiring subject before its object, let's call it a picture, has the structure of fantasy. For, firstly, it suggests that this stone could be my salvation, and second, that all I have to do is walk down the aisle to get it. Fantasy comes in the form of a picture of me being satisfied by an object. That's a picture not simply of the object, but of me attaining it and being satisfied. All I have to do is walk down the nave to be saved. It's a fantasy because when I get there, the altar turns out to be a stone and my salvation lies elsewhere. I haven't even attained a stone because touching something or standing next to it isn't having it. Salvation may be possible, it's just not to be had or held in a stone. And its attainment is never as simple as traversing a space. The architecture then does two things. It distances the object from me so it conforms to the conventional wisdom about objects of desire. You only have what you don't have. You only desire what you don't have. That's Plato, the Symposium. And it presents a seemingly credible scenario for attaining it. This is how the advertising image functions. Give me that Coke while I play beach volleyball, and I will be the man of my dreams to the woman of my dreams. Even my sweat will be as pure as the condensation dripping off the camera. Now, I won't say more here about the relation between advertising and space creation, except to point out that it is along these lines that we can understand how architecture intervenes in our desire. what makes me predisposed against a materialist architecture is simply that I do not think that the environmental problems facing our species will be solved by making better technology, but by intervening in our rampant desire, in changing what we want and how we want it. From my point of view, the interest in technology and the discourses of instrumentalization that attend it, including things like impact, which any of the British academics here will know about. From my point of view, the interest in technology and these discourses are simply distractions from something much realer and more threatening, that is, our capacity to desire ourselves into extinction. Now, Harman's thesis about the fourfold does not adequately account for the alter, and this may be a problem that he has with all symbolic objects. I'm not sure about that. But in any case, the first problem, I think, with Harman's fourfold is it simply doesn't really account for, this condition of me being here or you being here and seeing that thing there. Okay, so behind every object of experience, what he calls a sensual or intentional object is a real one. This is his fourfold. The real object is never exhausted by our encounters with it. It is always more than what we think about or can do with it. That's theory and practice. In the present case, I encounter a sensual object, the alter. According to Harman, there's a real one behind it that is never completely accessible, but must be there because the object world is autonomous from subjects, and because without it, we'd never encounter the same object twice. Okay. Now, the alter is both a sensual object and a real object, but it is the sensual object, not the real one, that is deeper than our experience of it, that withdraws, that is never fully grasped by what we think and say and do with it. There is that hallowed stone that terminates the nave and is the focus of a liturgy that bathes it with significance and promises me salvation. And then there's that stone which generates no heat of its own and which is, disappointingly, just a stone. It's not a deeper object. It is the shallow, desiccated husk of an object. The real object always brings us up short with the brevity of a brute fact. It is what it is what it is. By itself it goes nowhere, although it may be that it challenges us to make it a symbolic object. That's what we do with it when we insert it into a significant context, like architecture. By situating it in a nave, in a geometrized space, centered, framed, lit, sheltered, that stone becomes an altar. And so long as it remains spaced from us, it remains an altar. Okay. So anyway, architecture puts objects in relation to subjects in a way that defines the relationship spatially and temporally. I'm mostly talking about space, but I think it's pretty obvious that the temporal thing is in here as well because it involves traversing to that thing. Okay, so architecture puts objects in relation to subjects in a way that defines the relationship spatially and temporally. This is simply the form of a relation, similar to the subject-object relation in grammar, and like grammar, this is what Lacan would call a symbolic relation. It has two steps. First, architecture uses the figure-ground relation of space to define the object. The alters the figure to the ground, which is the nave. That's the object position. Then the subject position. The architecture positions the subject by distancing the object from the subject in space and time. The position of the subject has to do with this nascent sense of a picture surface. So architecture surrounds a thing with space, which gives it a contour and distances it from other objects. It then represents an object to a subject as an object, i.e. an intentional object, or what I call an object of desire. The architecture assimilates to representation. Gideon, for instance, who talks a lot about space, refused to talk about space itself, but only about space conceptions, as if recognizing the symbolic status or the symbolic function of space. I want to pursue this perspectival space conception further. Now, I'm not going to talk about it, but I hope it's... could you just hit that button? I mean, everything I've said about that paradigm, this sort of standing in the nave, this Renaissance paradigm, it applies equally in slightly different ways, but equally to kind of domestic modern scenarios. Could we go again? Okay. Now, I want to pursue the question of space and how it positions the subject, and how it positions the subject by invoking the plane surface. Okay. We have introduced the idea of the plane surface through the psychoanalytic account of desire, and through a kind of oblique reference to Renaissance perspective. It's also possible to understand it, though, this kind of conceptual picture plane. It's also possible to understand it within the space of modernism. For the theorists of modern painting and architecture, of which Greenberg and his architectural counterparts, Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky, are probably the most well-known, the picture surface was paramount. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about that paper, Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal, which probably all the architects in this room will know. In their groundbreaking paper, Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal, Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky argue that there are two types of transparency in modern painting and architecture, the literal and the phenomenal, and by implication, two kinds of space. Imagine gazing at a picture, at a painting or a facade. Literal transparency corresponds to a glass facade through which the viewer looks to see a space beyond, or to the canvas of an illusionistic painting. Now imagine another scene, gazing at a cubist still life or a literally opaque free facade. Phenomenal transparency corresponds to the implied depth where there is none. Derrida would have called it a reading event, Freud projection. In other words, reading depth into this or this, where at the same time, though when I say where there is none, I mean where at the same time one's very conscious of the sort of picture plane. When we follow their gaze, i.e. Rowe and Slutsky's, through the facade or painting into depth, we find that literal transparency corresponds to the unequivocal delineation of figure and ground, objects individuated by space. In the case of phenomenal transparency, figures and grounds seem to fluctuate, to trade places, to join at their contours, to interpenetrate without, quote, optically destroying each other, unquote. I'm not going to walk us through some plans to sort of go into this in more detail. I'm going to ask those of you who are not familiar with the paper to just simply believe me. Now this interpenetrating, joining at the contours, training places, blah, 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 this is not a blend, a continuum, any more than the chiseled forms of the cubist still life might blur to gray. It is simply the non-figure confronting the non-ground. I'm going to get to that. Now, if we reverse engineer their argument, Rowe and Slutsky claim that even the implied depth of the cubist painting and the corresponding space of the free plan depend upon the plane surface. Space is represented on the facade or painting, and it goes on being represented on the interior of the plan with implied picture planes. This intrusion of representation into space may seem to lead us away from ontology to epistemology. The significance of the intrusion of representation into the question of what exists for architecture is that it introduces the subject, for representation is always representation for a subject. Representation always puts an object in relation to the subject. You hit the next one. This is the famous disappearing slide. I guess before I begin, I'm going to just have to say there's a square here, okay, with at its four corners the words figure, ground, and not figure, and not ground. Okay, you can't really see it, but they mark the corners. And then there's a bigger square here, which we don't have to worry about. Okay, so figure, ground, not ground, pinning a square there. Now, we can diagram Rowe and Slutsky's argument on the Klein square, this thing. We begin by mapping in fact, I just have to say that all of Harman's fourfold diagrams are simply working through the logic of the Klein square. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm not aware that he fesses up, but I mean, he's clearly, this is a square that is a kind of analytic device that has a kind of history, and he's, as do many people, uses it. Anyway, we begin by mapping the terms of the argument, figure and ground, on the top corners of the square. All right? The second term, ground, is understood by the argument to be the other of the first. From figure and ground, we derive the negations, not figure and not ground, which are placed on the bottom corners. The Klein diagram depends upon distinguishing other from negative. In these terms, we are provisionally arguing for an ontology that begins with the thing and its other, like the object and space, which are irreducible to each other, but necessary for their mutual intelligibility. Now, there's a number of ways of negating a term. In a binary figure-ground spatial logic, the not figure is tantamount to a space, hence the seeming equivalence of terms along the diagonal axes. So for some reason, the diagonal axes, which were supposed to be secondary, seem to be stronger than in the graphics than the square. But anyway, so not figure and ground have a kind of equivalence there. Right? Yeah, actually, it's not really very important for what I'm saying. Okay. And there's a number of ways. In a binary figure-ground logic, the not figure is tantamount to a ground, a space. But free from that logic, a not figure could be anything, space or otherwise, that's simply not a figure to a ground. Similar for not ground. It's simply whatever does not play the role of ground to a figure. Depending on the context, these terms could be satisfied by concepts like Rossi's type or Plato's form, screens, fluids, clouds, Diller and Scafidio's blur building, spittle, or subjects. If we take the terms in pairs, they define two axes at right angles to each other. Figure and ground together define the plan forms of literal transparency or Renaissance space, right? That's altar in nave, right? Not figure and not ground define the plan forms of phenomenal transparency or modern space, the sort of free plan. Okay, there. These two spatial positions, the literally and phenomenally transparent, define the invisible space that delineates objects. We call this axis representation because it relates to a form of space whose main feature is that it is invisible, that supports representation and solicits the subject. So that's this kind of axis here. Again, you can't see it. It's in there. That's sort of Renaissance perspective, the glass facade of literal transparency, and then Korb's Villa Stein at Garst. Okay, so it supports representation and solicits the subject. It is a space insofar as we are able to symbolize it to ourselves and to others by means of words, drawings, and architecture, and has thereby been brought into discourse and made part of our world. Okay. Now there's another more difficult access, and this is maybe more important because it's less familiar. There's another more difficult access marked by the positions figure and not figure, and ground, not ground. So figure, not figure, axis here. Which forces us into the bastard logic of contradiction. These positions are difficult to characterize in anything but negative terms. Figure, not figure, would be things, I hesitate to call them objects, that are not individuated by space. I read Kant's things in themselves as things not yet so individuated. He understood that space and time were not objects of experience, but a priori forms of experience, he called them intuition, that precede experience and make it possible. We would not understand the world as a distribution of objects and a succession of events if we did not already organize the world in space and time. Things in themselves mark this a priori condition of experience and representation. This is what's before it, okay? They are real objects stripped of their symbolic and imaginary accoutrements. Piranesi may have glimpsed this impossible, inaccessible world when he drew the classical tombs on Via Appia Antica, stripped of the cladding by which architecture represents itself, drew them as formless lumps of masonry. Could you do the next? So that's Piranesi. This is kind of architecture with all the marble pulled off it, so it no longer it's beginning to lose its kind of classical language, and what's left is just kind of formless. And this is Koolhaas's CCTV building in Peking under construction. And I'm not going to say anything about this really, but there's something about the sort of intensity of structure here that seems to, although we usually think about structure as, articulating and framing space, it seems that this structure on steroids here has completely swallowed up the distinction between structure and space and maybe doing something vaguely similar. Okay. Figure, ground, not ground, that's the other term. We had figure, not figure. Ground, not ground, would be a space that cannot do what space is supposed to do, which is to individuate objects. See, these are very strange territory. Objects that aren't objects and space that aren't space. The only candidate I can think of for this kind of ground, not ground, is Corb's ineffable, unsayable space. Now, I'm not going to say much about that. Again, you're going to have to take my word for this. But in his account of this space, it seems to have lost its invisibility and begun to thicken, to become opaque. Elsewhere, I have argued that this, quote, boundless depth that, quote, drives away contingent presences, unquote, is not about a synthesis of the arts, as most Corb scholars would have it, but about a non-projective space. A boundless depth would be a space unbound by the vanishing point that terminates every view. Remember my alter scenario. And a boundless depth would be a space unbounded by the vanishing point that terminates every view, and thereby supports the appearance of objects as subjects. Walls would no longer converge as they recede from the viewer. If this space does not form views, it also does not emanate from a viewer. A boundless depth would be a space that cannot be put in relation to a viewing subject. And here's another reference, I'm going to have to take my word for it. Like Roger Caillois' suffering psychastheniacs, who can see the space they're in but not locate themselves within it, Corb may be in this space, but he is in it without position and without any of the localizing attributes that we expect for spatial subjects. Now, I call this axis real, and here we're starting to get back to Harman and whatnot. I call this axis, that one that went across, right? I call that real because whatever is on it is not representable by us to ourselves or to others. And if we have made a jump from the sensual to the if I've made in my argument a jump from the sensual to the representable, it is because for the purposes of this argument, we take it as axiomatic that what cannot be represented cannot be sensual. In this schema, the real object is in a different relation to the sensual than in Harman's ontology. It is not deeper or farther away than the sum total of its perceivable qualities, what we can perceive, describe, and communicate to others, but rather on a different axis. The possibility of this axis does not suggest that the other axis, representation, is falsification or illusion or subjective or non-autonomous or whatever. Indeed, the association of transparency with representation suggests the opposite. But it simply acknowledges that we throw the skein of the symbol, the concept and the image, over all our forms by necessity in order to bring them into discourse. So could we just go back to that last one for a minute? So, there's no claim that one of these is true or false and the others, or one is true and the other's false, or vice versa. It's just simply that one of these axes is about space and objects insofar as we can describe them and represent them, draw pictures of them, take photos of them, think about them, bring them into discourse. This other one is an axis which, real or no, seems to escape that. Okay. Now this axis here, this real one of indescribable objects that simply don't seem to respond to our thought and our eyes, as it were. This is also the axis of creation, from which something new and unknown emerges from a nowhere about which we cannot speak. The creator, author, artist, or architect, is in the position of having to draw forth something that is not yet known and not named, shaped, and materialized, but whose immeasurable distance pulls at his or her desire, and whose imminent proximity clouds him or her with anxiety. Something emerges out of nothing to become, by the arduous work of representation, figure and ground, object or space. We receive our symbols from others. We're skilled in the ways of endless recombination. This paper is an example of endless shuffling around of symbols. But rarely do we have to confront the horror and ecstasy of something really new, creation in the sense of something coming from nothing. Arguably, the invisibility of space, in which we stand before the plane surface looking into infinite depth the way the frontier legionnaire stands at the parapet, is a defense against the anxiety of that possibility. As if every time we look into space at things, we're saying, look, there's nothing there. It's, space is invisible. Okay, could we jump to just one more possible object? It's not a real object because we can't see or represent the real. But again, like the Piranesi and the Koolhaas thing, I suspect maybe we're glimpsing a little bit the real. We're getting a sense of something. I mean, it's probably why this thing was so bloody unpopular. It's probably also why it seems like they printed this photo on blue jeans or something, or corduroy. I don't know why it's so badly. It's so pixelated or something. Anyway. Okay. Now I'm going to wrap this up now. I'm going to jump a few bits here. I guess I should just say that one of my orientations in architecture has been Lacan, and while I don't want here to get into it, I mean, I have been referring to Lacan's symbolic, imaginary, and my hands are cold. I don't know why. Symbolic, imaginary, and real orders, or what he also calls them registers of experience. So, just broadly, what he calls the symbolic and the imaginary, sort of what we can think about and what we can perceive, is broadly what most people regard as reality, and what Lacan calls the real is something that no one's ever heard of. It's, as I've said, it's something that resists thought and perception. It's slightly different from Harman's idea of the real. I think we can glimpse the real sometimes, the way if you whip around really quickly, you can sometimes catch just a glimpse of death's head sitting on your shoulder, but we can never actually see it and bring it into discourse. Okay. Anyway, the collapse. Okay. Before the conclusion, a summary. We began by pointing out the paramount role of space in architecture. It is the material of architecture. Although this was more a policy statement or definition of what architecture is than an ontology, nevertheless space appears to support the subject as we know it. And this gives it a certain necessity. We intimated that position in space was an inescapable aspect of subjectivity. Okay, there are dispersed objects, but no dispersed subjects. But our main point was that the salient symbolic feature of this space is the structured subject-object relation that assimilates to the picture surface. In my view, Harman does not treat subjects systematically enough. In his ontology, they're just another object that other objects have an effect on, like fire has an effect on cotton. My account of space at least gives a systematic account of one salient aspect of subjectivity, that as subjects we situate ourselves before our objects, that space is structured for the subject in a way that makes it possible for this to happen, and that we use architecture to do it. Okay? Subjects are special objects, not because they have feelings and stuff, but because they have a special relation to space. Okay? Now, where does that leave ontology? Our most minimal claim, then, is that architecture has an ontology consisting of objects in space, which is different from, but does not necessarily challenge object-based ontologies like Harman's. Space is necessary for objects. Without it, they'd all be lumped together as one. Okay? It is a dialogic ontology for a heterogeneous world. The problem is that it is as difficult to situate space within Harman's classification of sensual and real as it was to situate that symbolic object, the altar. If, following Harman, we call this experienced space sensual, on the basis, that's basically the space in here, on the basis that it structures the subject-object relation, we reserve real space for the nothingness that remains if we strip out all the objects and surfaces by which space is shaped and qualified by architecture. That would include even geometry, because geometry is a function of the objects in a space and not the space. Okay. Actually, could you just whip through? Okay, that's more, yeah, see. Well, no, back. This is just about sort of the way arguably the qualities of a space are given to a space by the surfaces that define it and the things that are in it. You strip them all out, what do you get? You strip all that out. On this view, space, real space, space itself, is a featureless nothingness. The difficulty with this reading, okay, in other words, this would be Harman's view of real space. If this is sensual space, strip all this stuff out, and then you'll get real space, okay? A featureless nothingness. The difficulty with this reading is that it is hard to understand how Harman's real, which goes in the direction of the essence of things, the real presence of things far away from the subject, could arrive at nothingness, which seems to negate presence and essence and facilitate proximity. Okay. Now, there's another possibility for real space is the one that shadows the subjective space of representation, which seems to have been alluded to by Kant and Le Corbusier, and which aligns with my category wrecking real axis. It also assimilates to Lacan's real. All right. This space confounds the logic of figure ground and does not thereby individuate objects or subjects. Does not thereby individuate objects, subjects, or space. Real or no, the problem with this one is that real or no, it is difficult to understand this space as space. This space has seemed to thicken to become material because it is not transparent to subjects and objects. It eliminates the subject because it cancels the difference between space and object. It is the opposite of the nothingness that we put forward a minute ago as Harman's real space. Okay, now this is a kind of the next paragraph's a little bit difficult, and I think what it really needs is another Klein square to diagram sort of others versus negations and whatnot. Okay? I'm also done very soon here. Alternatively, a third alternative then, we regard space as simply the necessary precondition for the existence of objects. Okay? It is the principle of difference and individuation presupposed by a heterogeneous world, without which the world would be a continuum. Okay? So, in other words, another possibility for real space is just simply it's the possibility for difference, for individuating objects. You take away that possibility and you no longer have a world of the many, you have a world of the one. If we take this position, then real space, the space of my real axis, would simply be the cancellation of this principle. Now, although it may be necessary for the existence of objects, there's no reason to think that this principle of difference is necessary. Again, this is not the nothingness that is the other to objects that we put forward as Harman's real space. Rather, it's the negation of the possibility for individuating objects. There's nothing, according to this view, there's nothing ontologically necessary about objects. Space did not have to exist. The world of objects is contingent in an ordinary sort of way, in the sense that this altar might have been that altar, or this Coke might have been in a different can, or it might have been a Pepsi or something. But behind this ordinary contingency is the more radical contingency of space. Subjects could never carve the world up into the particular objects that it is, the altars and the cans of Coke, if the world were not already marked by the potential for objects in the first place. Because we can individuate the world as objects, because we can situate ourselves as subjects to our objects, it must be marked by this potential. The world could have been one, but if it were, we would not be here to know it, because a world without space and objects would not support subjects, ourselves, as we know them. Okay. So, simply the idea that space is this kind of logical precondition for having difference, for being able to individuate. I guess I think it's pretty much the last slide. If we could go to the World Trade Towers there. Okay. So, this is called, instead of a conclusion, a collapse. I'm just going to collapse. I'm not going to conclude. I summarized, now I'm going to collapse. We glimpse this radical contingency in certain catastrophes, like the collapse of the World Trade Towers, where it seems that space, object, and subject are returned to a state of one. People and spaces, office furniture, suspended ceilings, walls, windows, and doorways were reduced to a single inhalable primordial soup, like Genesis in reverse. As if all the articulations of difference upon which architecture is erected, all the articulations between subject and its objects, the space that contains them, as if all the details that carefully articulate materials and surfaces from each other were undone. Now, buildings fall down all the time, but it was something about the encompassing scale of this one that turned this collapse into an expression of an ontological possibility. These moments always seem to come at us too fast for comfort. It's interesting, this is a kind of an explosion into one. That's what I'm saying, as opposed to, usually we think of an explosion as something that takes one thing and makes it into many. This is kind of or an implosion as going into one. This is a kind of explosion that turns everything into this kind of not object, not space, okay, and not subject, okay. As if to compensate for this eruption of a Lacanian, as if to compensate for this eruption of a real oneness into our world of difference, the image machine went into overdrive. The shock with which the collapse was received and the media overdrive that attended it, remember people used to say it was just like the movies? The shock with which the collapse was received and the media overdrive that attended it confirmed that what we witnessed was the emergence of the Lacanian real. Even the real comes with a message. It's just not possible to articulate it with certainty. It is not the message here, it's not exactly saying that our world could have been different, which obviously it could have been. Indeed, something new is on ground zero now, but rather that our world is only a possible world. Starting from the position of the subject, which was what Pozzo visualized. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, Pozzo was that, Andrea Pozzo was the plate of showing in section and plan that figure of a man looking down the nave, visualizing the extension of the nave. Okay, that was Andrea Pozzo. That was the first figure of his book on architecture and perspective from, I think it was 1699. Starting from the position of the subject, which was what Pozzo visualized, I had hoped to rescue the world from idealism, but I am not sure that I have. If I've argued that Harman's object-oriented ontology is too reductive to account for architecture, that it needs space, and that space seems to drag with it the spatial subject, our only way out has been to argue that at least this spatial world is contingent. Okay. Now I'm done, but I had one or two other slides, so could you just hit the button? It's just more of, this thing about kind of how we could, where we glimpse the real, the real possibility that all of this articulation into space and objects and whatnot might sort of cease to exist, not exactly because something collapsed, but because the logical possibility for difference is somehow reversed. I think we can get a sense of it like in the smarminess of this facade, for instance, and go on, next one. I also think that something, there's this thing about representation in space, which I haven't quite worked out, but I suspect that one effect of the kind of cancellation of the space of representation would be that we would like pixelate or something. There'd be a kind of extreme disruption in our ability to represent ourselves, and so that's what that's showing. And then one more, and then I'm probably done, but I think there's just two more slides after that. Oh yeah. Oh, here's another one. Yeah, this is Google Earth, which I looked up because I think we're here, and I thought that was quite interesting in that. The next one. I mean, you've probably seen that. So I think we can catch. There's certain moments where we can see the contingency of the world, and then I think I just have two more, which sums up. I think my paper could be summed up in the following two slides. Just this thing about we are here, the way space positions us, and then the next one, that it's always, this is Wittgenstein, we're always staring kind of into the void. Okay, so that's me.
Thank you. So now we have time for some questions, and that will be followed by an interval. So any questions? Okay, well, I will start while you think of all your questions.
Be kind.
Well, that was a really interesting talk, and it was really great. You gave such a articulate reading of the Klein Square and bringing it back to Harman. And I thought it was very interesting in the beginning, you kind of summed up the difference of thinking about space in an object or an object in space, and they're kind of quite different ways of seeing things. So I wanted to ask you about your definition of an object, because, if you could define it, because when Harman writes, his objects encompass so many things, from this microphone to the architecture exchange as a kind of institution to this, and that's encompassed within the Swedenborg Society. And so, how does that fit in with your definition? And how does, it's interesting when you talk about, you kind of end up with kind of clouds and pixels and blurring, and that's almost this strange space between figure and ground, and how that relates to...
Yeah, I mean, Harman, to be honest, I don't really understand Harman, or I don't understand him completely, but he wants to define objects as broadly as possible, probably because he doesn't want to get backed into some kind of reductivist corner. So kind of almost anything can be an object. I mean, very abstract relationships can be an object. I mean, the Oedipal relationship that you have with your father that you don't even know about, that only he knows about, that's an object. Anything that you can sort of throw this, as I said, the skein of the symbol over, anything you can symbolize, really, it seems like Harman would call an object. And the problem I have with those is that I don't understand why or how he can understand their autonomy, okay, within those kind of objects, okay? But they do need to be autonomous for him because all objects are. And the problem is that if you say, well, those aren't autonomous, those are kind of like only exist in your head or something, then I think the problem is then, every object only kind of exists in your head. And the altar that I started with, as that thing which promises my salvation, I mean, that is this what I call a symbolic object that like Harman's, seem to only exist in our heads. So I don't know quite how he deals with that. I mean, I think the way I'm using object, it's actually very similar to him, except I don't have the problem with autonomy. I don't care if they're autonomous or not, okay? It's, an object is sort of anything you can objectify, right? It's, it can be a relationship, it can be a very abstract thing. It's basically whatever you can put a name on it, you can point to it, or a lot of them you can't point to actually, but you put a name on them, you can refer to them, that makes it an object. Anything that you could desire, okay, is effectively an object in the terms of my argument. And I mean, it really comes, I think in psychoanalytic discourse, it comes from erogenous zones, like the bits of a body that you objectify because you sexualize them, a body is just a continuous surface, and the bits that you take a magic marker and draw a ring around and say, okay, this is, an erotic object, that's the kind of model for this. Anything that you can refer to that could be an object of desire is an object in the terms that I'm using it. Now, the thing about the sort of blur and all of that, it's not really about the blurring, it's not really a real blurring. I mean buildings, it could collapse. You could, imagine all sorts of things collapsing and just becoming a kind of a dust. I mean, reverse, you could play a film of making bread backwards, so you start with a loaf and you wind up just with a cloud of flour, it's really a logical problem. It's the blurring is what happens if the logic, the symbolic logic that you use somehow gets disrupted so you're unable to refer anymore, right? That's when the whole thing about the object breaks down. It's not that this thing suddenly turns to dust and there's no difference between it and air. It's that the logic of differentiation, the logic of reference, gets so disrupted that there's no way to reference this anymore. I mean, this is as much an argument about logic as about things, actually. I think they're very related.
My question's about representation.
I'm sorry?
About representation.
Yes.
I was a little bit surprised when you said representation always puts an object before a subject, because for Lacan, the object is that which divides the subject. And an effect of this is the subject fades from the scene. The subject disappears in Harman's terms. I would say representation is actually always a misrepresentation, a veiling of the object. And just a little last comment, in terms of the trauma that you presented at the end, trauma for Lacan is a pure presence without an absence. It's in fact the lack of lack. It's the object which is too present.
Yes, I don't disagree with that. I guess I'm kind of speaking perhaps too generally, but I mean, for instance, just about representation and misrepresentation. I mean, Lacan would say that every time I represent an object to myself, there is some misrepresentation in that, because I'm always trying to find myself in those objects, and myself is always elsewhere. It's unconscious, basically. So I'm looking at that, and my narcissism is what. So, but I'm still putting that within the sort of broader gambit of representation. About the real and presence. Yes, I mean, there is a. I mean, I don't think it's quite so simple anyway, as you say. But this kind of axis of that I call the real here, and then I had these examples of kind of non-object, non-spaces. The interesting thing about them is that they do seem to be full presence, okay? In other words, this space here is actually invisible, and because it's invisible, it allows us to, do things, either with others or with objects or whatnot. And this eruption of the real, this real space, is actually a kind of thickening. It's the opposite of garden variety space, which we regard as a nothing. It's kind of, it's the space in that house, the White Reed's house, which was just this solid chunk of concrete. So it's precisely this the presence that makes it impossible to have objects, actually, or to have relationships with them, because we need space to be invisible in order to communicate. The World Trade Tower example is not. It's not a nothing in the sense that of what I think Harman's space is, where it would be, if you were to take everything out of this room, that would be the nothing of Harman's real space. The thing about the World Trade Towers is that we've lost that kind of dividing of object from space to get presence and absence, and we're left with something else which is just stuff. And even, with the real, I mean, even presence and absence is already a symbolic distinction that you can't apply to the real. So, we're left with something which just stifles thought, actually. So, thanks.
We have one question over here. Joe?
I'm not quite sure how to formulate this. It seems to me that one, although you mentioned formalism near the beginning of your talk, you didn't really take up the question of what is the relation of form to both space and objects. Now, when people like Fry and Bell introduced formalism to criticism, at least in England in the early 20th century, popularized the term significant form, which is not a very satisfactory way of putting it, but it simply communicated that some shapes are better than others, right? And
or more significant.
Two objects might have the same objective volume, but one is beautiful and the other is not. Now, the odd thing is that this never seems to have been transferred to architecture, to speak of significant spaces. And it seems to be to do with the fact that the discourse of space really gets going strongly in the 1890s, just at the point when spaces are being replaced by space. That is to say, classical architecture on the whole, leaving Baroque on one side for a moment, but on the whole dealt with finite spaces, finite volumes. And it was all about finitude and boundedness. Modernist space is unbounded, as in the open plan. And the curious thing about modernist space is that in the age of formalism, it becomes less formful than objects. And so there's a curious paradox that the more we talk about space in the discourse of formalism, the less objectifiable it is, in the same way that an object has traditionally been. That's what I think.
Was there a question in that, or is that a comment? I'm not sure that the phenomenal transparency done what you're calling it's not formless in the sense that it's beyond spatial figures. I mean, if we looked at the plan of Garsh, they're very clearly spatial terms that Rowe and Slutsky used to describe that space thing. I'm not sure that it's come into architecture, or at least think about it in contemporary, but it does.
Nobody else seems to have coined the term.
Yeah. Right, but I mean, spaces are significant, aren't they? They do signify. Some more than others, but in the same way that objects some more than others. I was just going to say, though, about I've often thought that Rossi's theory of architectural types is a kind of attempt to talk about significant space form. Okay, he says about the type, it's a logical principle. We're not talking about buildings, we're not talking about this basilica or that basilica. It's more like, linear plan, centralized plan, tower, parametric plan, whatever. These are the architectural types. And I think that's, and with them goes, because they repeat, because you can say, this is a parametric plan and that's a parametric plan, or this is a basilica plan and that's a basilica plan. Because they repeat, okay, because you can find something that repeats over many years and whatnot, they accrue meaning, in the way like a word does. The more times you use a word, the more its meaning gets layered and enriched and whatnot. And so in that way, spaces, that's a way to understand how spaces become more and more significant. Okay, that kind of. So, I think there is, I just pull that out of a hat because I have a PhD student who's writing on Rossi, and I'm very interested in Rossi, and blah 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 blah. But I just throw that out as it's a slightly oblique way of talking about significant space in architecture, but I think you could read Rossi that way.
Okay, we have one last question,
Right.
and then we'll wrap up.
All right. Maybe if I'm quick, we could have.
You've been speaking about perspective and the subject in relation to the object and in relation to the nave. But I was just curious on your kind of view about reconciling the notion of the subject and the object in relation to, because Harman is quite against that distinction between subject and object, and the whole point, obviously, of speculative realism is that putting the subject outside of the kind of the point of importance, and saying how kind of the realist perspective that the object-to-object relation is more important. And just to get your perspective on that, kind of your perspective in relation to psychoanalysts and the Lacanian notion, where the subject seems to be more highlighted in that regard.
Right. Well, just a couple of things. I don't think that again, I have to preface this by saying I can't really speak with authority about Harman because I've read a couple of very intriguing things, but I don't have the bigger picture with him. But I don't think, based on what I've read, that he treats the subject very satisfactorily. Not because I was just saying with Joseph here a minute ago, not because he doesn't give it as much importance as I would like. In other words, I'm not like miffed, or something, but because I don't think in his own terms he treats it in a systematic way. Okay, the subject seems to him to be, it's just it's basically an object like others, but it has a few slightly different features to it that but all objects have effect on other objects, so it isn't just a subject is the kind of object that other objects have effects on, because fire has an effect on cotton. And he even says somewhere, I think you can ask of the stone what's it, or ask of the fire what is cotton like, or something. So, but I'm happy with that, actually. I mean, we are objects too. We are, but I don't think he, in his own terms, systematically kind of like says, I don't think he has a theory of this subject. I think, he just has anecdotes about this subject. And I think that, and it would be interesting to see how you could develop a theory of the subject without going to psychoanalysis, okay, which obviously, for obvious reasons, he wouldn't want to do. What I've tried to pull out here, I think, is much more systematic than he does, to say, because what I'm basically trying to say is that the subject is a kind of object, but it's a kind of an object that has a very particular relation with space. Okay, it's a spatial object in a way. Okay, and that's far more systematic than anything that I've read that he's written about this subject. I mean, maybe it's utter rubbish what I just said, but at least it's more systematic. I hope that sort of said something for you.
Okay, thanks so much. We will have a 5-minute break, and then Peter Carl will give his talk. So thanks very much.